All of Tuscany stood in awe, including a young boy who would one day contribute greatly to the Medici legacy. He would become private tutor to the Medici heirs and the greatest scientist of the age, Galileo Galilei. The world of Cosimo's descendants was the perfect stage for Galileo.
If you're an art buff, that's kind of all over. The juice has gone out of it by the time that the Medici dukes are installed, by and large, give or take. But the scientific revolution is just getting going.
Through the eyes of Galileo, a fusion of artist and mathematician, wine became light held together by moisture. As a courtier, his greatest selling point was his uniqueness. He was a scientist.
Galileo was one of the many wonders that the Medici court could exhibit. He was appointed as mentor of the Medici young princess. So, on one hand, he satisfied the thirst of, splendor by having at court someone who could entertain and wonder people with experiments and never seen instruments. And on the other hand, he fulfilled one of the new requirements of principality, providing the young rulers with a technical education.
Galileo had discovered the uniformity of pendulum vibrations, a critical step in the accurate measurement of time. He had made a name for himself as a brilliant thinker and a troublemaker. But the Medici legitimized his boldness. In 1610, they appointed Galileo royal professor of mathematics and philosophy, with a healthy salary of 1,000 scudi a year.
There was a certain level of official investment in Galileo, and given the kind of claims he wanted to make, the university would have not been the right institution. So I do believe that he needed a court, and the Medici provided that.
As Galileo's reputation spread through Italy and Europe, his Medici patrons granted him celebrity and protection. In return, Galileo ensured that his discoveries emerged first at the court of the Medici.
Galileo is this hybrid between a philosopher, a courtier, and a writer. You know, the patron expects competence. There's no question about that, but also expects the spectacle. Galileo had that, and most mathematicians did not. They didn't have the other set of skills, you know, how to turn a dry topic into something entertaining.
School vacations became the seasons for experiments, as Galileo's Medici students learned through observation. People had always assumed that because it was solid, ice was much heavier than water, but not Galileo.
Galileo managed to turn buoyancy, things floating in water or sinking in water, into a court spectacle. Now, that takes talent.
Galileo asked whether two balls of different weights would fall at the same speed. Most people thought the question was absurd. Of course, the lighter one would fall more slowly. But Galileo was not convinced. By dropping two balls from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, Galileo proved that all objects fall at the same rate of acceleration. The royal professor had prefigured Newton's theory of gravity by half a century.
He was desperately trying to find simple arguments for complicated, for huge phenomena. That was always his angle. He was a master at trying to find these little vignettes that could encapsulate a very complex problem.
Galileo's hunger to observe was fed by a magnificent new invention, the astronomical telescope.
Most nights, Galileo would point the telescope toward the moon, and then you write down or you draw what you see every night. The way you build the case is by showing what you have seen over like 30 or 40 nights.
But what Galileo observed went against everything people had been taught. The moon was not the pure white heavenly body of church doctrine. Galileo was amazed.
It is like the face of the earth itself, which is marked here and there with chains of mountains and valleys.
All of what people had been believing in regard to astronomy collapsed, because the idea that beyond the celestial vault you get into the world of perfection proved to be wrong. Otherwise there wouldn't be all of those imperfections on the moon. And through the eyes of the prince, the telescope adds to the court another element of originality and wonder.
Galileo was the first man to discover that the sun had spots, to notice the unusual shape of Saturn, and to identify the Milky Way. And he was the first man to spot the moons of Jupiter. He named these mysterious objects after his patrons and protectors. He called them the Medici stars.
Behold, 4 stars reserved for your illustrious name, which make their journeys with marvelous speed, like children of the same family.
They were the most permanent monument that the Medici could hope for, because statues, wear out, paintings fade, and the satellites of Jupiter do not fade. Nothing happens to them. They're there forever. I'm sure that watching the Medicean stars was probably a family sport.
Thanks to Galileo, the Medici name was written into the universe. And thanks to Medici patronage, Galileo was the most famous scientist in the world. The English ambassador recorded his achievement.
The professor has discovered 4 new planets rolling about the sphere of Jupiter, the true cause of the Milky Way, and that the moon is not spherical. He has overthrown all former astronomy.
The Medici had dominated Florence for over 200 years. What had started as a local revolution now had spread beyond the borders of Tuscany. At the royal court of France, the world's first ballet had been presented to Queen Catherine de' Medici. In England, Shakespeare had thrilled massive audiences with extraordinary new plays. While in Italy, a radical new art form had been unveiled. Born in the house of the Medici, opera took the dramatic stories of classical heroes and set them to music. It had been performed by Galileo's own father. One by one, 3 generations of Medici dukes inherited a position of extraordinary power, and Galileo had taught them all. He had bestowed on them the gift of education, a rare gift they would never forget.
I think that probably Galileo was more important to the Medici as time went on. For somebody like Ferdinand II, Galileo was an important image maker. The Medici were lucky. it's a remarkable coincidence to have one of your subjects turn out to be, such a scientific star.
But there was still a force in the world more powerful than the benevolent wisdom of an individual thinker. The force of religious conformity. A friend of Galileo had paid the ultimate price for intellectual freedom. Giordano Bruno was a Dominican friar. He had devoted his life to the service of God, but he was also a scientist. For publishing his theory that the universe was infinite, he was burned alive by the Roman Inquisition. In exceptional cases, the Inquisition showed mercy. They placed a bag of gunpowder around their victim's neck. Galileo knew how powerful and dangerous the truth could be. And he knew his own ideas were testing the Inquisition's patience. For over 1,000 years, the Church had taught that the Sun and all the planets revolved around the Earth. This fundamental truth underpinned the very essence of Christian identity. But Galileo had observed the universe for himself. He had come to the radical conclusion that the Earth, in fact, revolved around the Sun. His skeptical friends protested. Surely, if the Earth was traveling through space, then they would feel it here on Earth. Galileo argued that, as fish remain inside their bowl, even if the bowl is moved around, so we can happily exist untroubled by the motions of the planets. It was a dangerously seductive idea.
I think the revelation that the Earth goes around the Sun rather than vice versa must have just been shocking. It must have been earth-shattering, literally, because it threatens the whole notion of the Christian cosmology.
The choice that now faced Galileo was simple: neglect the truth to save his neck, or publish and be damned.
I do not believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use.
Galileo believes completely that the Earth goes around the Sun. He knows that he cannot say that. Okay? So he's walking a thin line. Galileo was an old man by 17th century standards, so maybe there was an element of desperation that maybe he knew that he was taking a risk.
Galileo prepared a subtle argument in the form of a conversation between three friends. They just happened to be discussing the structure of the universe.
He says, "I'm not publishing a treatise. This is a philosophical comedy. These are fictional characters, everything is fictional, right? So you cannot hold me accountable for what fictional characters say."
Galileo submitted his text to the church in Florence so that it could be checked for signs of heresy. The church insisted on changes. Galileo agreed. And in 1632, Galileo's pioneering masterpiece was published.
Under normal circumstances, normal being friendly he would have got away with it. In a more hostile environment, people would simply say, we do not care that Galileo has used the literary genre of a dialogue between fictional or dead people. He has said this, and we are going to hold him accountable.
Galileo called his book The Dialogue of the Two World Systems and dedicated it to his student and patron, the Grand Duke of Tuscany.
Whose liberal munificence is the means by which it finally reaches publication.
When the dialogue hit the streets of Florence, it became an instant bestseller. Galileo had written the first book of popular science.
I wrote in the colloquial tongue because everyone must be able to read it.
But when the dialogue reached the headquarters of the church in Rome, the Pope was furious.
The Pope feels the need to put an end to Galileo writing about his scientific theories because what this produces is essentially a body of knowledge that contradicts the authoritative assertion of the Church, which, according to the common opinion of the time, was the only source of truth.
Galileo was officially summoned to face the Inquisition. Now more than ever, he needed the protection of the Medici. The Grand Duke tried to prevent his mentor being hauled to Rome. But the Pope was in no mood for discussion.
When His Holiness gets something into his head, that is the end of the matter, since he hardens and shows no respect to anyone. This is really going to be a troublesome affair.
If you are accused by the Inquisition and you manage to stay away from Rome and negotiate things remotely, it's one thing. If they get you to Rome, you're a goner.
In 1633, Galileo arrived in Rome. The Inquisition had their man at last.
It's really a misnomer to say that Galileo's trial was a trial. It was a trial in the 17th century in the sense of the term, but it definitely was not a trial the way, we mean it. Not only there is no jury, but the suspect has very little access to the case that is being built. In Galileo's case, the machinery had been going on without him knowing for a long time. They already had a file on him. It's amazing. I mean, it's actually scary. If you read the manuscript, the documents, you see that the machine starts, is set into motion, and it's not clear how it can be stopped.
Ordered to dress in the white robes of a penitent, Galileo had been shown the instruments of persuasion.
The Inquisition reliance on torture is not seen as part of the punishment. It is seen as a practice to get to the truth. The belief is that the suspect has seen things, has done things, and he or she does not want to admit that. And so torture comes in. They really squeeze the truth out of you.
Back in Tuscany, the Medici Grand Duke faced a terrible choice. For over 200 years, his family had nurtured generations of radical thinkers. They were far more than financial backers. The Medici had prided themselves on intimate involvement with the creative process. As a family, they had recognized great ideas as well as public relations opportunities. But now, they were a royal dynasty, anxious to retain control of their territory. And they depended for survival on the benevolence of an even greater power, the papacy.
The Pope basically says, look, stop pushing. He says, tell the Grand Duke that he's not going to come out looking good, or he's not going to come out well from this. That his support for Galileo is not going to help him. It's really a threat.
The Medici Grand Duke, Ferdinando II, stopped paying Galileo's expenses. On the 22nd of June, 1633, on his knees in the belly of the Vatican, Galileo denied what he knew to be true.
I still hold as most true and indisputable the stability of the earth and the motion of the sun. I am in your hands. Do with me what you please.
When the Medici stopped not just patronizing but protecting Galileo, they put an end to a certain idea of Renaissance, which consisted in patronizing any type of art, no matter which their religious or ideological implications were.
Galileo was sentenced to house arrest in his beloved Tuscany. It was there that he died, a broken old man. In a fit of remorse, the Medici planned a public funeral, but the church overruled them. There would be no public mourning for Galileo. He was the last in a galaxy of Medici stars.